We're at 1:49, are we not?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
For a healthy relationship between love of one's native land and a sound sense of belonging to our larger human family, it's helpful to keep in mind that global society is not the sum total of different countries, but rather the communion that exists among them.
I like that.
Really, let's frame that and put it on everybody's wall.
I love that.
The mutual sense of belonging is prior to the emergence of individual groups. Each particular group becomes part of the fabric of universal communion, and there discovers its own beauty. All individuals, whatever their origin, know that they're part of the greater human family, without which they will not be able to understand themselves fully. To see things in this way brings the joyful realization that no one people, culture, or individual can achieve everything on its own. To attain fulfillment in life, we need others. An awareness of our own limitations and incompleteness, far from being a threat, becomes the key to envisaging and pursuing a common project. For man is a limited being who is himself limitless. Oh, let's think about that last sentence for a moment. And then also let's think about who wants to read next. Man is a limited being who is himself limitless. That sounds almost like Teilhard de Chardin. George Simmel.
It sounds like the Tao Te Ching.
Who's George Simmel?
You're right, Phil. It does sound like the Tao. George Simmel, Bruch und Tour, Essays der Philosophen zur Geschichte, Religion, Kunst und Gesellschaft. Yeah. Okay. So some diverse sourcing there. Wow. Man is a limitless being who is himself limitless.
That it's kind of hard to get your head wrapped around that one.
That is. I agree.
Well, the reason I said it sounds like Teilhard de Chardin is because it resonates, at least for me, with Chardin saying that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience.
I've heard that. In that sense, it makes more. In that sense of what you've just said, this sentence, I think, makes a little more sense. It's a little easier to understand the concept.
Yeah. It also, and this is gonna sound tangential in its way, but it reminds me of the crossover work I've been reading between spirituality and quantum physics. Quantum mechanics. Well, it's the whole idea that at a quantum level, everything, it's not that everything falls apart, it's that is where everything comes together. And there are limitless possibilities. That literally anything can happen at any moment. Because at a quantum level, all bets are off at any given moment. That's just the bizarre nature of quantum mechanics and quantum physics. All the things that we think are rules in our Newtonian way of thinking, the clockwork mechanical universe, which is where we're really comfortable, don't really apply at the quantum level. it just seems to flow by its own very, very strange set of rules or non-rules. And that's why I'm always fascinated by that idea that at the very basis of quantum mechanics, and deep down inside all of these tiny little subatomic particles is some force that they simply describe as intent. There's something down inside all of it, down in the empty center of all of it. And that's the other thing. It's all empty down at the center, except for this force called intent. There's something that makes the subatomic particles want to come together to form atomic particles. And then there's something that makes those atomic particles want to come together to make atoms and molecules, and then to form compounds and organic and inorganic materials. I mean, there's something in there called intent that makes it all form together. That's it, and there's nothing else they know what to call it. John Cobb, the theologian, described it as the energy event in his process theology. But I find it kind of a marvelous idea to play around with and to think about, because it means that God is down at the very, very smallest level of microcosm. We're always used to thinking of God in the macrocosm, at the largest level of things. This puts God down at the very, very smallest, tiniest level. There's Luther's language of God being in, with, and under creation. I'm not sure what Luther would do with quantum physics, but that's what I get excited about. So when I see a phrase like "man is limited, a limited being who is in himself limitless," that's where my mind starts to go off on all kinds of interesting ideas. It also means that if we can get our preconceptions out of the way, we have limitless possibilities in our relationships. We are the ones who set up the barriers. We are the ones who keep making these strange rules about where we can and cannot relate, and why we can or cannot relate. Okay, that's enough for me. You're going to hear more than enough from me tonight. Who would like to continue reading?
I'll
Read a
read.
couple more paragraphs. Let's see, 151, starting with your own region. Thanks to regional exchanges by which poor countries become open to the wider world, universality does not necessarily water down their distinct features. An appropriate and authentic openness to the world presupposes the capacity to be open to one's neighbor within a family of nations. Cultural, economic, and political integration with neighboring peoples should therefore be accompanied by a process of education that promotes the value of love for one's neighbor, the first indispensable step towards attaining a healthy universal integration. In some areas of our cities, there is still a lively sense of neighborhood. Each person quite spontaneously perceives a duty to accompany and help his or her neighbor. In places where these community values are maintained, people experience a closeness marked by gratitude, solidarity, and reciprocity. The neighborhood gives them a sense of shared identity. would that neighboring countries were able to encourage a similar neighborly spirit between their peoples. Yet the spirit of individualism also affects relations between countries. The danger of thinking that we have to protect ourselves from one another, of viewing others as competitors or dangerous enemies, also affects relations between peoples in the same region. Perhaps we are trained in this kind of fear and mistrust. I have
Perhaps.
a couple of thoughts on that. Especially the very last sentence, Pastor. Perhaps we are trained in this kind of fear and mistrust. So I know you'll remember the sermon that you gave about learning to hate when you were a young boy in, was it Kansas? Learning to have a hatred. Your friends, your cousins were taught to hate and have a negative effect on Black people. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That was a powerful sermon. That was a really powerful message, and I know Karen and I have shared it with others. And so one of the things that I would say, and I've mentioned this to others as well. One of the gifts that my parents gave me, which I never really came to fully appreciate until I was much older, is that they never talked about any group or any ethnic group, religious group, or just any group negatively. It was never part of their personalities to be negative about another group of people. I realize as I've gotten older just how much of a gift that is, and it means that that I don't have to almost unlearn bad thoughts, bad practices of looking at others.
That was a generous gift your parents gave you.
Yeah.
You don't realize it until you're older. I just didn't realize it until yes, that's all I can really say. But it was a very generous gift that I don't think they realized it's a gift that they had given me.
Probably not. If they felt that way in the first place, then it would not occur to them that giving, sharing it or whatever, it's just the way it was for them.
Good point, Margie.
I guess I come at that last sentence a little differently, in the sense that perhaps we were trained in this kind of fear and mistrust. And I wonder, my sense is that the need for safety is a need. It's not something we need to be trained in, and so we our fear is a result of a difference. And once we notice a difference between something else and us, we have to, the fearful among us have to resolve that fear.
Bob, I think in some ways what you say is unconscious. It's an unconscious reaction.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it can be a conscious decision.
You're absolutely right. This can be channeled, and as we've learned in the last 4 years.
Well, there's an interesting book in our library by Frankl called Man's Search for Being. I think he's passed. Was a psychology professor. He was in the concentration camps and was able to live through it. And one of the key things he said in his book is that you always have the choice on how to react. And that's kind of what I'm getting to with your comment about safety, is that we do have an innate response to protect ourselves. But we also have the ability to decide how to react, which at times is probably something I should think more about.
Bob has a point, though. We do seem to have an innate fear of the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's
What comes to mind, Steve, is children being taught about stranger danger, and how I felt when Kellen was little. I really struggled with that, because there were so many children that I was encountering who were just had a wall up, just cold, just non-responsive, when I would approach them, because I was a stranger and that was dangerous, So, I mean, it's kind of a balance, I suppose, that we have to choose to strike, in order to teach our children properly the way we want them to think, as opposed to being, the blanket fear of, just like you said, the fear of the other, the fear of anybody you don't know yet. Instead of it being a friend you haven't met yet, it's a potential danger.
Yeah. I remember when I did my cross-cultural internship as part of my seminary training for 6 weeks. I lived and worked at Trinity Lutheran Church in Inglewood, but I was living the first 3 weeks with a man in Inglewood in a Black neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood, and then the second 3 weeks in South Central LA, again with a gentleman who had a house there. And I was the only white face in the neighborhood both times. It was a remarkable experience to be the other in that situation. And to, when I would come to the house in the evening, to have all of the neighbors looking at me like, who are you and what are you doing here?
Are you here? Yeah.
You're out of your neighborhood, bud. The very first night I went to the second house to stay was the night of the big earthquake.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And of course, I had seen everybody kind of eyeballing me as I went to Mr. Sims' house. He had this guest house on his property, which is where I was staying. So I was in that place all by myself. And you can just imagine in the dark hours of the early morning when that house started to shake. I didn't know what the heck was
Right.
Anyway, but it was
your first earthquake.
Oh no, it wasn't my first earthquake, but it was my first really, really major. Well, no, the Northridge quake was, but anyway, you can. I didn't have any idea what was going on, and he had told me, you might want to be, you might not want to go out in this neighborhood after dark. It's like, oh, okay. Anyway, it was a really valuable experience to be in those communities and be the other, to be the person who looked different from everybody else and came from somewhere else and spoke a little differently than everyone else, and was the one trying to fit in. And it made me really aware of how much fear and mistrust we carry around with us, and how much we are on guard in situations where we either are not known or do not know those coming in.
I think there's another element to the fear and mistrust, and that is the misunderstanding and dislike. When my daughter married a black man, we were having a little party, and my dad admitted, he said, "I just can't eat at the same table with a black man."
Oh, wow.
Oh, how awful.
And had it was a real problem for my dad to accept Anthony as his grandson-in-law. And my dad, we had experiences with Asian, with people of the Jewish faith. None of that was an issue with him, but Anthony was an issue. And yet before my dad passed away, Anthony and my dad always hugged, always kissed before they left each other. And the acceptance and understanding that my dad received from Anthony, being such a kind and generous spirit and soul, my dad learned a lot.
Based on what Phil said earlier, I'm sitting here reflecting on my childhood and growing up, and my parents never made derogatory remarks about other ethnics. And I just realized what an impact that did have on me later. I went to nursing school at LA County Hospital, and over half the employees were Black. And that just never was an issue for me. They treated me the same way they treated everybody, and I treated them the same way I treated everybody. And I just realized, based on Phil's comments, that I received a wonderful gift too. That's just mind-blowing. I'm really going to think about that today.
We can see it's blowing your mind. You've got all sorts of weird things coming out of your head, Margie.
Yes, right. Absolutely. And I mean, we had a Chinatown, and one time there was a Chinese man who was bludgeoned to death, and his storefront was closed, but there was blood on the walls. And we all just felt terrible that this poor man got beaten up by somebody. And I mean, I was like maybe 10 when I saw the blood on the walls, but just the fact that my folks knew about it, we talked about it a little bit, but never a derogatory term was ever used in describing people of other ethnicity. I'm just really, I am quite shocked by that revelation. Ooh, thanks, Mom and Dad. Wow.
I mean, I'll continue with 153 and then I'll hand off to somebody else. There are powerful countries and large businesses that profit from this isolation and prefer to negotiate with each country separately. On the other hand, small or poor countries can sign agreements with their regional neighbors that will allow them to negotiate as a bloc and thus avoid being cut off, isolated, and dependent on the great powers. Today, no state can ensure the common good of its population if it remains isolated.
That's a good, I like that one.
Yeah. This is also where borders can become a problem, and where borders can create bigotry.
Or states like Texas, who decided to have their own power and cut off from everybody else, are now all freezing their butts off and there's no power that they import because they were taking care of themselves. Well, guess what?
Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah. That's a prime example of libertarian economics gone weird. That's Friedman and Ayn Rand writ large.
That's good.
Our poor little granddaughter is freezing. Her and her 2 children. I mean, they have no power. They're absolutely freezing. They're in Austin. It's a mess.
The generator manufacturers are going to have a big uptick in business.
I called my sister yesterday. She said, "Yeah, we're okay, but I really don't want to talk about it."
The journal carries an article this morning that supposedly about $1 million market value worth of milk is being dumped every day.
Wow.
And
Oh my gosh.
and I guess some chicken outfit has like 19. I thought it was 1900. They were talking about 200 of 1900 chickens, but it's 200 of 1900 like chicken coops are without power.
Oh.
So you know what's happening there.
Well, that's going to affect the price of food.
Oh, and I guess oil and natural gas down there, I mean, it's just skyrocketed.
Yeah, I bet.
Oh yeah, and then their governor tried to blame it on sustainable energy sources, which are only 10% of their supply. It's just like, try again, buddy.
Yeah, right.
Well, if they put, I mean, one of the issues for the nuclear generators problem was that the water they used to cool was freezing in the pipelines.
Right.
And so it wasn't anything to do with nuclear. It was just, they didn't wrap their.
And gauges were freezing on their gas and oil supply lines.
Oh my word. Oh.
It's like, okay.
I've decided that God is trying to tell us something with all this cold weather and natural disasters, but we're not listening somehow. I don't know what he's trying to tell us, but I think he's trying to get our attention.
Well, this is, the science has been trying to tell us for a long time that the climate is changing and we need to take steps to fix it and adapt.
Yeah.
Streams of all kinds.
Now we're seeing these sweeping polar vortexes. Never mind.
Okay, I'll read. Chapter 5, A Better Kind of Politics. The development of a global community of fraternity based on the practice of social friendship on the part of peoples and nations calls for a better kind of politics, one truly at the service of the common good. Sadly, politics today often takes forms that hinder progress towards a different world.
You think?
Yeah, that deserves an exclamation point there. Forms of populism and liberalism. Lack of concern for the vulnerable can hide behind a populism that exploits them demagogically for its own purposes, or a liberalism that serves the economic interests of the powerful. In both cases, it becomes difficult to envision an open world that makes room for everyone, including the most vulnerable, and shows respect for different cultures. Popular versus populist. In recent years, the words populism and populist have invaded the communications media and everyday conversation. As a result, they have lost whatever value they might have had and have become another source of polarization in an already divided society. Efforts are made to classify entire peoples, groups, societies, and governments as populist or not. Nowadays, it has become impossible for someone to express a view on any subject without being categorized one way or the other, either to be unfairly discredited or to be praised to the skies. Tell me the current meaning of the word populist.
It depends on who you're applying it to.
Okay.
Donald Trump was a populist. He relied on the support, on a really broad-based support of people with a particular ideology.
Okay.
But you could say, in a sense, that Joe Biden is a populist because he's relying on a really broad base of support from people with a particular ideology.
Okay.
It just, and that just makes the Pope's point here. It's how the word gets used. When you are relying on a broad base of popular support within the population, that can classify you as a populist. When you're going to the people for your support, whether they're informed or not, and generally the implication is that they are not well informed, that they are not blessed with the best information. That's generally the implication when you see the term populist used, that these are not necessarily people who are supported by the best science or the best thinkers or the best strategies.
Hillary had a name for them.
I'm sorry, what was that, Bob?
In fact, Hillary had a name for them.
Oh,
Remember, didn't Hillary call them the
basket of deplorables.
The bag of the basket of deplorables?
deplorables? Yes.
Yeah.
So, but wouldn't, on the other side, wouldn't you say that Theodore Roosevelt was a populist?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, you could also say that Franklin Roosevelt was a populist. But again, using the label doesn't always tell you much about who it's being applied to, because both Theodore and Franklin used their populist power to educate the people they were relying on for their power. Whereas there have been others who have been populist leaders who simply use that populist power to manipulate the people from whom they were drawing their power.
So Hitler would be a good example of that, probably the best example of that.
Yeah, Hitler, Mussolini, they were populist leaders also. But they didn't bother to educate their people, they just used them. Anyway.
But isn't some of the populism part of democracy, letting the people vote and decide on, like we just had an election? This is a democratic society where we do that.
Good point.
Yes.
I want to know. I just looked up the definition on my phone. That's why I'm okay. All right. 157. The attempt to see populism as a key for interpreting social reality is problematic in another way. It disregards the legitimate meaning of the word people. Any effort to remove this concept from common parlance could lead to the elimination of the very notion of democracy as government by the people. That answers that question. If we wish to maintain that society is more than a mere aggregate of individuals, the term people proves necessary. There are social phenomena that create majorities as well as megatrends and communitarian aspirations. Men and women are capable of coming up with shared goals that transcend their differences and can thus engage in a common endeavor. Then too, it is extremely difficult to carry out a long-term project unless it becomes a collective aspiration. All these factors lie behind our use of the words people and popular. Unless they are taken into account, together with this sound critique of demagoguery, a fundamental aspect of social reality would be overlooked.
Oh, wow. That's a really important paragraph, and it would take us a long time to really parse it well. Do
you say that because he brought in the concept of demagoguery?
Yeah. And also, there's, if we wish to maintain a society that's more than a mere aggregate of individuals, the term people proves necessary. There are social phenomena that create majorities, as well as megatrends and communitarian aspirations. Those kinds of phenomena, those trends, those majorities, those aspirations, may or may not be positive. That's the thing that deserves us, deserves our time and thought. I mean, those are the things we don't stop and think about enough. We look at the numbers. We look at the trends. We don't look at the color of, or the nature of the energy behind it. We simply say, well, this is what the majority is doing. This is where we are, which in one sense you have to do because that's the reality we're living with. But that central question is it good? Is it positive? Is it good for all the people? Okay, this is where the people are in terms of the majority of the people. But are the people being thoughtful? Or are the people being a mob? True confession time. I have aclophobia, fear of crowds. I just get really nervous in the middle of a big crowd. I don't mind being up on a stage in front of a big crowd, but being in the midst of a crowd, I just get really, really nervous because crowds don't think. And I've noticed the same phenomenon in large groups of people. What we saw on January 6th is a great example of that. Crowds don't think. Crowds tend to somehow get an impulse of their own and they do what they do. And it can be really dangerous. And you see this sometimes, again, writ large in movements in a society, in a culture, in a nation. I think that's part of what he's talking about here when he talks about our use of the terms populism and people, and how that can be manipulated by demagoguery. I've talked enough.
Interesting, thank you.
You know, I think populism, let's see, how can I say this? Something has to give rise to populism. I think that there has to be some inequities or dissatisfaction that makes it possible for people to become to associate themselves with a group that is populist. And the thing that comes to mind is Theodore Roosevelt breaking up the large conglomerates, that were they were so strong and powerful that they were able to crush their opposition. And people realized just how much of it at a disadvantage they were, because they had no power, had no economic power. And that dissatisfaction certainly became a reality with the antitrust movement. So I just go back to the point that I think in order for populism to become attractive, there have to be inequities and there has to be dissatisfaction, so that movement can give people hope where they don't see any hope.
Or at least a place to express their dissatisfaction. And band together with others who are dissatisfied.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's part of the dynamic.
It's a scary dynamic because it can go either to a force for positive in the society, or it can lead to demagoguery. It can kind of go either way.
Right. And unless those who are dissatisfied take time to really analyze why exactly they are dissatisfied and what is leading, what are the factors that are creating their dissatisfaction, they can be easily manipulated, because someone will come in and tell them what's creating their dissatisfaction. And they may not take time to examine what they're being told. That's where demagoguery comes in. That's where Fox News comes in. Sorry, I didn't say that. Yes, I did. Okay.
You don't like Fox News?
Oh, yeah, I really don't.
Huh.
It's not news, not their commentators. It's propaganda.
Interesting. Okay, 158. Here there can be a misunderstanding. People is not a logical category, nor is it a mystical category. If by that we mean that everything the people does is good, or that the people is an angelic reality. Rather, it is a mythic category. When you have to explain what you mean by people, you use logical categories for the sake of explanation, and necessarily so. Yet in that way, you cannot explain what it means to belong to a people. The word people has a deeper meaning that cannot be set forth in purely logical terms. To be part of a people is to be part of a shared identity arising from social and cultural bonds. And that is not something automatic, but rather a slow, difficult process of advancing towards a common project. Not sure I get all that, but okay. Nobody's talking, so 59. Popular leaders, those capable of interpreting the feelings and cultural dynamics of a people and significant trends in society, do exist. The service they provide by their efforts to unite and lead can become the basis of an enduring vision of transformation and growth that would also include making room for others in the pursuit of the common good. But this can degenerate into an unhealthy populism when individuals are able to exploit politically a people's culture under whatever ideological banner for their own personal advantage or continuing grip on power. There's Hitler for you. Or when, at other times, they seek popularity by appealing to the basest and most selfish inclinations of certain sectors of the population. This becomes all the more serious when, whether in cruder or more subtle forms, it leads to the usurpation of institutions and laws.
Yeah.
That makes me think of third world countries, as we call them, but even some of the, like Myanmar is going through a tumultuous episode right now. And it's like, what, the 14th one in history? So they would be an example of this.
It sounds exactly like what we just went through on January 6th.
True.
This just summarizes the reason why it came about.
Yeah, it's a good example, Karen. Closed populist groups distort the word people since they are not talking about a true people. The concept of people is in fact open-ended. A living and dynamic people, a people with future, is one constantly open to a new synthesis through its ability to welcome differences. In this way, it does not deny its proper identity, but is open to being mobilized, challenged, broadened, and enriched by others, and thus to further growth and development.
Mm.
That's the US. Another sign of the decline of popular leadership is concern for short-term advantage. One meets popular demands for the sake of gaining votes or support, but without advancing in an arduous and constant effort to generate the resources people need to develop and earn a living by their own efforts and creativity. In this regard, I have made it clear that I have no intention of proposing an irresponsible populism. Eliminating inequality requires an economic growth that can help to tap each region's potential and thus guarantee a sustainable equality. At the same time, it follows that welfare projects, which meet certain urgent needs, should be considered merely temporary responses. Ooh, that's good.
Mm.
No intention, an irresponsible population. Welfare projects, yeah. We know welfare gets abused in this country. The biggest issue is employment. The truly popular thing, since it promotes the good of the people, is to provide everyone with the opportunity to nurture the seeds that God has planted in each of us, our talents, our initiative, and our innate resources. This is the finest help we can give to the poor, the best path to a life of dignity. Hence my insistence that helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in the face of pressing needs. The broader objective should always be to allow them a dignified life through work. Since production systems may change, political systems must keep working to structure society in such a way that everyone has a chance to contribute his or her own talents and efforts, his and her own talents. For there is no poverty worse than that which takes away work and the dignity of work. In a genuinely developed society, work is an essential dimension of social life, for it is not only a means of earning one's daily bread, but also of personal growth, the building of healthy relationships, self-expression, and the exchange of gifts. Work gives us a shared responsibility for the development of the world and ultimately for our life as a people. The benefits and the benefits and limits of liberal approaches. The concept of a people, which naturally entails a positive view of community and cultural bonds, is usually rejected by individualistic liberal approaches, which view society as merely the sum of coexisting interests. One speaks of respect for freedom, but without roots in a shared narrative in certain contexts, those who defend the rights of the most vulnerable members of society tend to be criticized as populist. The notion of a people is considered an abstract construct, something that does not really exist, but this is to create a needless dichotomy. Neither the notion of people nor that of neighbor can be considered purely abstract or romantic in such a way that social organization, science, and civic institutions can be rejected or treated with contempt. Charity, on the other hand, unites both dimensions, the abstract and the institutional, since it calls for an effective process of historical change that embraces everything: institutions, law, technology, experience, professional expertise, scientific analysis, administrative procedures, and so forth. For that matter, private life cannot exist unless it is protected by public order. Ooh, that's good. A domestic heart has no real warmth unless it is safeguarded by law, by a state of tranquility founded on law, and enjoys a minimum of well-being ensured by the division of labor, commercial exchange, social justice, and political citizens.
Okay, let's pause there. Charity, remember, is caritas, which would be like agape. Not charity the way we tend to use the word charity. And that last part sounds a lot like the preamble to the Constitution.
It would be interesting to ask the Pope what he thinks of the Constitution.
Yeah, it would be interesting to ask him that. We, the
like
people of the United...
Private life cannot exist unless it is protected by public order.
Yeah, a state of tranquility, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, yeah. And ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Promote the general welfare, all of that. It seems to be kind of summed up in what he's saying here. Caritas, agape, unites both dimensions, the abstract and the institutional. Calls for the effective process of historical change that embraces everything. So if we're going to really love each other, it calls for us to embrace all of these things: institutions, law, technology, experience, professional expertise, scientific analysis, administrative procedures, and so forth. I don't usually think of administrative procedures as a way to love people, but you know, they have their place. Okay, this has been quite a day.